Nick, it's so funny because we talk about the party apparatus, and you're right, whether it's a Democrat and Republican, this is one thing they agree on, the idea that ranked choice voting or this top four system really undercuts their power. And at the same time, I feel like so many of these primaries, in and of themselves, are no longer as controllable, so to speak, by the parties. In other words, if you ask party operatives or just the strategists, who would you like to see as the nominee? Oftentimes, those candidates don't make it through the primary, despite getting the backing of the party. And so, again, this is not the system you write about, the Tammany Hall and the sort of party boss system of the old days. We don't really even have that now. So what is it ultimately that the parties are afraid of? That it just simply feels like then they have really no influence at all? Or is it that they now have to readjust the way that they think about campaigning?
I think it's frankly fear of change. If you have political power right now, even if it's very tenuous in a closely divided state,
Yeah.
uh, you want to cling to it. And that's what they're doing, despite the fact that, to your point, I don't think it's in their medium to long term interest to do so. Both parties are a declining market share of the electorate right now. It should be to their advantage to want to reach a wider base of
Yep.
potential voters. But they only think one election cycle at a time. And that's why I think they're opposing this. And the reason why they're opposing it, I think, is less to do with the fact that the actual party leaders have a lot of influence in candidate selection. They've lost that to the activists in their own party. What they are trying to keep, however, is the dynamic that the other party might nominate someone so far outside the mainstream that they have an advantage in the general election. Democrats in Nevada, for example,
Mm,
and we saw this over the last two election cycles, will spend money to try and elect or nominate, the
right.
most extreme Republican to fight in the general election because it may get them some advantage. And so they manipulate the current system for short-term gain. And I think that's, again, short-sighted because not only is it not great for the parties, it's terrible for our democracy. It's perpetuating this zero-sum partisan warfare that, yes, you can win the next election, but what are you going to get done in Congress as the system becomes so much more divided and dysfunctional? And when you're playing with fire of electing the most extreme right members of the left and the right. So it's not sustainable. And things that aren't sustainable do tend to stop at some point.
Right. Now, um, the other disconnect, I think, Nick, for this cycle, and we talked about this a little bit, but I'd like to dig a little bit more into it, is this real frustration among voters, this desire to upset the apple cart, to break the status quo, to go after the system, break down the system or the institutions. And it sure seems to me like what you were offering is a way to do that. Why are voters not connecting your issue with the kind of things that they're saying that they want, which is a change to the system and shaking up and shaking out the status quo?
Well, in many ways, that's why I think our reform campaigns were a bit of a victim of the problem that we're trying to solve, which is one of hyperpartisanship and polarization. And what I mean by that is when you ask voters, do they support the idea of an all candidate primary where they get to vote for anyone they want and that leaders have to earn majority support? 60 or 70% will say yes, including majorities across Republicans, independents, and Democrats. But they don't hold that view with a lot of conviction right now. And so
Right.
they'll keep saying that maybe up until Labor Day. And then when the parties start to ramp up their opposition machine and plant doubts, like actually this new system is intended to rig elections to support the other party, and they
Hmm.
weaponize the partisanship, the negative partisanship in the system, well, then a lot of voters begin to, go back to their camp and will vote against these reforms. And it's not the voters' fault. They're hearing from messengers they trust on their own side, false information and fear mongering. And so they will say, okay, seems too risky, not right now, and vote no. That means we have a lot of more work to do in our movement to educate and engage voters earlier on than before these campaigns as to what problem we're trying to solve, how these reforms will solve the problem, and ultimately impact the issues that they care about. So if you're upset about the state of our economy and a broken immigration system and a rising budget deficit, or maybe the latter part is just me these days, these reforms are critical to actually addressing those problems. And short of it, we're going to be continuing in this sort of pendulum politics where we're switching parties every 2 years, but
Yeah.
not really making much progress.
Yeah.
Uh,
Not much is changing.
right.
Yeah. Ultimately. So, talk about the kind of money that was spent in some of these races, your side versus the opposition. Were you greatly outspent? Was this different from state to state? What did this look like?
Well, at the 30,000 foot level, as you know, we just came out of an election cycle in which both parties spent, what,
Yeah,
$16 billion
yeah.
trying to keep and maintain their own political power. The movement that is trying to actually fix the system in total, probably over a little around $150 million invested across all 9 different states with various reforms on the ballot. And we had the resource advantage, but that's required actually to do the kind of
Mm.
education and persuasion that we need to get voters to yes. The no side spent tens of millions of dollars to be sure, and has the upper hand in just needing to be able to place some doubt. So they had enough resources to successfully do that. But I do think that more important than resources is the investment of time. This is not an issue that will win on a single election day. This is a decade long fight. And like any movement, uh, it will build a stronger foundation after each of these campaigns because we now leave the cycle with a stronger asset of more awareness, more support, stronger infrastructure than ever before.
Nick, there's not a lot of examples we can point to of how ranked choice voting has made an impact in terms of doing the kinds of things you say that it would do, by uh, helping to elect folks who are more willing to be bipartisan or willing to buck, say, their party on certain votes. But we have had a top two system in some of these states like California and Washington for how long? How many years? 20 years, maybe
Yeah, in their
more?
current conception, actually in California, about 15 years now, a little under 15 years.
Okay. So, is there any evidence in a state like California that even opening up the primary, which is what you're making the case, whether it's ranked choice or just letting everybody vote on one ballot, so the top two candidates, regardless of party, go on to the general election, is there any evidence that this has actually moderated the kinds of people who are coming to Congress or coming to the legislature in that state?
The short answer is yes. And the goal is less about sort of this elusive idea of moderation and more about this idea around improving representation. A blue state or a blue district, even under this reform, is going to elect a more progressive candidate. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
in Louisiana, where they got rid of primaries 50 years ago, uh, they're going to elect a more conservative, representative from their state or districts there. However, what is true in Louisiana and true in California is it'll be a candidate who represents a true majority of their constituents and can govern without the fear of being primaried if they work collaboratively on an issue. And in both states, they have benefited from better governance as a result of that. There was one study out of USC by Professor Christian Gross who found that members elected under these nonpartisan primary systems are about 18 percentage points less ideologically extreme relative to new members elected from closed primary states. And they measure that based on roll call voting in Congress. So that's one data point for it. But the best anecdote I can give is that right now in this new session of Congress coming up in January, the only members that are still there who voted to impeach or convict
Impeach. I
Donald
was
Trump
just going
after
to say that.
January 6th came from states that abolished party primaries. And no matter how you feel about that issue, it's a good issue to sit to um, represent what it means to buck your party, like in a pretty serious way. And the fact that these members still survived and the rest did not suggests to me there's a pretty big difference, right, between having an open system or closed one.
That's right. And yet it also leads us right back to where we started in this conversation. For partisans, they hear that and they say, oh, well, there's no price to pay for a member of my party basically abandoning us, right? So I don't know that I like this idea that, whether if I'm a Republican, I say, oh, well, really, all it's doing is insulating anti-Trump or sort of people who are against the vision of the majority of the party from defeat. If I look at again the examples in Maine or in Alaska, the most successful people in those states have all been folks who don't necessarily fit the current Republican mold, Susan Collins, Elisa Murkowski, both of whom have not exactly been best friends of Donald Trump's. So, how do you convince somebody who's a conservative Republican or a strong supporter of Donald Trump that this system actually it's not going to hurt you guys? It's not benefiting only certain types of Republicans or certain kinds of Democrats.
Again, I would point to Louisiana as a good example of the type of system that we advocate for, and you don't get a lot of anti-Trump Republicans coming out of that congressional delegation. You do get a principled conservative like a Bill Cassidy, but you also get a more Trump-aligned conservative like a Senator Kennedy there too. The system doesn't dictate the type of candidate that gets elected. The people still do. It's just a
Mm-hmm.
majority of the people will still get to do that under this current system. The question also reminds me of what I write about in the book in terms of the importance of disentangling, which should be a separate system that parties should use to recruit and endorse and support their candidates, from what our publicly funded and government run election system should do, which is to try and discern voter preferences in the best way possible to elect the most representative candidate. Right now, the two parties want to be the only teams in the league and setting the rules of the game. But we should have more of a separation, really, between the role of political parties in our democracy and the role that our election system and the 50 now 1% of Americans who are not affiliated with either party should have a voice in that system. And that's really what these reforms are intended to get at, is to not injure the political parties, but put them in their proper role, in our democracy, which I think will be to the benefit of the whole country.